Imagine finding out that the man you married, the father of your child, was sent out on a simple errand, a quick trip to the store for groceries, and that by the time he walked back through his own front door, someone was already waiting for him in the doorway with a gun. Imagine that the person who sent him out on that errand was you, and imagine that this wasn't even the first time you tried to have him killed, not the second time either, the third. That isn't a dramatized opening. That's the actual sequence of events prosecutors laid out in a Brooklyn courtroom, point by point, attempt by attempt, until a jury took less than 3 hours to decide they believed every word of it. A wife who tried to poison her husband's dinner. A wife who, when poison didn't work, brought a lover into her own house and used him to arrange a shooting. A wife who, when the first shooter missed, simply tried again. And underneath all of it, the entire time, nearly $900,000 in life insurance, sitting there, waiting to be collected. Hit subscribe before we go any further, because this is one of those cases where every new detail makes the last one worse. And if you want to see more stories like this one, drop a like and leave a comment. It genuinely helps this reach more people who are into this kind of deep dive. Now let's get into it. This is the story of Alicia Noel Murray, a Brownsville, Brooklyn home on Lott Avenue, and a murder plot so layered that even after a conviction and a life sentence, the case still isn't entirely finished. Omar Murray was 37 years old, a Jamaican-born ironworker, the kind of steady, physical, blue-collar job that doesn't leave much room for anything except getting up early and coming home tired. He and Alicia lived together in a Brownsville row house, in a neighborhood that doesn't get much attention unless something terrible happens in it. Alicia herself had trained and worked as a registered nurse, employed for a time with the Visiting Nurse Services of New York, before she was eventually let go. On paper, in the years before 2013, they looked like an ordinary working couple raising a baby together in Brooklyn. Underneath that surface, though, the marriage was falling apart in a very specific and very ugly way. At some point, Alicia discovered that Omar had been unfaithful, that he'd been with a prostitute. When she confronted him, he admitted it outright. He told her he was sorry, and when she pushed further and asked if it had happened before, he told her no, this was the first time. Whether that was true or not, it clearly wasn't enough to repair anything, because what happened next wasn't a separation, and it wasn't counseling, and it wasn't even a straightforward affair of her own as retaliation. It was the beginning of an actual plan to end his life. In October of 2012, prosecutors say, Alicia made her first attempt. She poisoned Omar's dinner. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because poisoning someone's food is not an impulsive act. It's not something that happens in a moment of rage. It requires planning. It requires access. It requires a level of premeditated calm that most people can't even imagine mustering against a person they claim to love. The attempt failed. Omar didn't die, and as far as the public record shows, he apparently never even realized what had actually happened to him that night. Around the same time, in January of 2013, just over a month before Omar would eventually be killed, Alicia began an affair of her own with a man named Damon Lovell. This wasn't a secret kept at arm's length either. She brought him into the house. She slept with him there more than once while Omar was upstairs in another room, and it was to Lovell, prosecutors say, that she eventually confided what she actually wanted. Not comfort, not companionship. She wanted her husband dead, and she wanted Lovell to help her find someone who could make that happen. On February 6, 2013, less than 3 weeks before Omar Murray would finally be killed, someone made an attempt on his life outside the home and missed. Accounts differ slightly on exactly who pulled the trigger that first time, but what's consistent across the record is this. It was already the second attempt on Omar's life, and it still wasn't the one that worked. Most people, after 2 failed attempts to kill someone, might reconsider. Alicia and Lovell didn't. They kept going. Lovell reached out to a man named Kirk Porteous. The arrangement was simple and almost startlingly cheap for what it was buying. Lovell gave Porteous a $500 down payment and a gun that had come from Alicia herself, with a promise of $3,500 total once the job was finished. Sit with that number for a moment, because it's going to matter a lot later in this story. $3,500 to end a man's life, when the payout waiting on the other side of that life was nearly $900,000. On February 24, 2013, at just before 1 in the afternoon, Alicia sent Omar out to the grocery store. It's a detail that sounds almost mundane, the kind of small domestic request that happens in households every single day. Except this time, prosecutors argued it wasn't mundane at all. It was the final piece of the setup. When Omar came back and walked through the door of his own home, Kirk Porteous was waiting for him. He shot Omar 3 times. Omar died right there, inside the doorway of the house he lived in. Alicia would later describe what she experienced from inside the house in the moments around the shooting. She said she heard him talking to someone outside that she couldn't make out the words, and then she heard what she described as 3 sharp pops like a balloon being popped underneath a shirt. She said she called his phone. No answer. She called again. Still no answer. She looked outside and saw a vehicle she didn't recognize. She locked her bedroom door. She was, in her own words, very scared. Only then, she said, did she call 911. There's a detail that gets lost if you only hear the phone call description and not the fuller picture investigators eventually assembled. Alicia wasn't alone in that house during the shooting. Her 10-month-old baby was upstairs with her the entire time. While her husband was dying in the doorway below, she says she stayed locked in a bedroom with their child, waiting, listening, deciding what to do next. Whatever was actually happening inside her in that moment, the image itself, a mother and infant upstairs while a hired gunman finished a job downstairs, is one of those details that's almost impossible to fully process, no matter which version of events you end up believing. For a while, remarkably, Alicia wasn't connected to the murder at all. Investigators didn't have an obvious thread leading back to her, at least not immediately, and for over a year, life simply continued. And this is where the case takes one of its strangest turns. Less than 2 years after Omar was killed, Alicia remarried. Her new husband was a man named Jose Abreu, and the two of them got married in September of 2014. It's worth pausing on how audacious that timeline actually is. This isn't a widow who waited a respectful several years, quietly rebuilt her life, and eventually found new love long after the investigation into her husband's death had gone cold. This is a woman who was, by prosecutors' own later account, still actively trying to cash in on her murdered husband's life insurance policies within days of his death, and who was remarried to someone else less than 20 months after he was killed. Whatever grief she may have performed publicly in the immediate aftermath, it clearly wasn't slowing anything else down. And then, in what might be the single most chilling detail in this entire case, the pattern didn't stop with the remarriage. At some point during her relationship with Jose Abreu, Alicia took out a life insurance policy on him as well. It's unclear from the public record whether this happened before or after she discovered that Abreu, too, was cheating on her, and that he had a child with another woman from an earlier relationship. What is clear is that when she found out about his infidelity, she didn't simply confront him the way she'd confronted Omar. She reached out directly to the mother of Abreu's child, and in an email to that woman, she wrote in effect that Jose was a liar and a cheater, and that the two of them, she and this other woman, were both too good for him. Read that detail again next to everything that came before it. A husband cheats. She poisons his food. It doesn't work. She starts an affair, arranges for him to be shot, and it takes 2 attempts before it finally works. Less than 2 years later, she remarries. She takes out a policy on the new husband too. When he cheats, instead of repeating the pattern, she simply reaches out to his mistress with a message about how they're both too good for him. It's almost as if, once caught, the pattern didn't disappear, it just lost its teeth. The instinct toward insurance and control seems to have remained fully intact. The follow-through, at least the second time around, apparently didn't. Eventually, the investigation into Omar's murder caught up with all of it. Detectives worked their way to Damon Lovell, who told investigators that his girlfriend had asked him to find someone willing to kill her husband after her attempt to poison him had already failed. Lovell agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors, laying out the entire arrangement, the down payment, the gun, the $3,500 promise to Kirk Porteous, in exchange for a plea deal that would ultimately bring him 15 years to life in prison rather than facing the far harsher consequences that awaited Alicia and Porteous. Both Alicia Noel Murray and Kirk Porteous were eventually brought to trial, tried separately, in Brooklyn Supreme Court, in front of Justice Neil Feiertag. During Alicia's trial, prosecutors laid out the financial motive in stark terms. She had taken out nearly $900,000 in life insurance on her husband before his death, and had attempted to begin cashing out those policies within just days of him being killed. Assistant District Attorney Emily Dean argued that what drove Alicia wasn't fear, wasn't self-defense, wasn't any of the justifications that sometimes surface in cases involving spouses. It was, in her words, a determination to murder her husband. Alicia took the stand in her own defense and denied any involvement in planning or orchestrating the killing. Her attorney, Winton Sharp, argued forcefully that she'd had nothing to do with her husband's death, that she was, in his words, heart-wrenched for Omar's family. It's a strange thing to hear, a defense built around a client's grief, delivered in the same courtroom where prosecutors were describing, in granular detail, a poisoning attempt, an affair, a failed shooting, and finally a successful one. The jury didn't need long to decide which version of events they found more convincing. They convicted her of first-degree murder on June 8, 2017, after deliberating for only about 3 hours. Kirk Porteous was convicted separately by a different jury of first-degree murder and criminal possession of a weapon, for what prosecutors described as physically pulling the trigger 3 times in that doorway. On June 29, 2017, both Alicia Noel Murray and Kirk Porteous returned to court for sentencing. Justice Feiertag handed down life sentences without the possibility of parole to both of them. Inside the courtroom, Omar's family didn't hold back. His brother Andrew stood and told the court directly that he had once thought Alicia loved his brother, that Omar deserved far more than what he got. A cousin read a written statement on behalf of Omar's mother, delivering a line that stayed with nearly everyone who covered the case afterward, that Alicia should spend as many years in prison as there were dollars she thought she'd collect for her husband's life. Acting Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez, addressing the sentencing directly, said that through their premeditated and callous actions, both defendants had forfeited their right to remain part of society, and that what they had carried out was a heinous and cruel execution of an innocent man, driven by nothing more than pure greed. For a case with this much documented evidence, this many independent witnesses, and a jury that took only 3 hours to reach a verdict, you might assume the story ends there, with a life sentence and a closed file. It doesn't. In 2022, 5 years after the original conviction, New York's Appellate Division, Second Department, ordered a new trial for Alicia Noel Murray. The reasoning wasn't about her innocence or guilt in any factual sense. It was about a specific, technical failure at trial. The presiding judge had never instructed the jury that Damon Lovell, the prosecution's central witness, was legally considered an accomplice to the crime, and that under New York state law, an accomplice's testimony must be corroborated by independent evidence before a jury can rely on it to convict. Without that instruction, the appellate panel found, the jury may have simply taken Lovell's word at face value, without weighing the fact that he had every incentive in the world, a plea deal that spared him from a life sentence of his own, to tell prosecutors exactly what they needed to hear. It's a genuinely uncomfortable legal wrinkle, because it doesn't dispute a single fact that came out at trial. It doesn't claim the poisoning attempt didn't happen, or that the insurance policies weren't real, or that Porteous didn't pull the trigger. It simply says that the process by which the jury reached its conclusion may have been flawed in a specific, legally significant way. and that under the law, Alicia is entitled to have the case against her presented again, this time with the jury properly instructed on how to weigh her lover's testimony against her. Technical analysis. What makes this case particularly useful to look at closely is the way the financial evidence functioned as a kind of second, silent witness throughout the entire proceeding, one that never needed to take the stand and never had a motive to lie. Nearly $900,000 in life insurance policies, taken out before Omar Murray's death, followed by an attempt to begin collecting on those very policies within days of his killing, created a timeline that essentially prosecuted itself. Witness testimony can be challenged, memory can be picked apart, and cooperating witnesses like Lovell can always be accused of shading their account to protect themselves. Paper trails from insurance companies can't be cross-examined into changing their story. The second technical thread worth pulling on is the sheer number of attempts it took before the plan actually succeeded, and what that pattern reveals about premeditation as a legal concept. Prosecutors didn't have to prove a single spontaneous act of violence. They had a poisoning attempt in October of 2012, a missed shooting attempt in early February of 2013, and finally a successful, hired killing later that same month. 3 separate, distinct efforts to end one person's life is about as far from an impulsive crime of passion as it's possible to get, and it's exactly the kind of pattern that tends to eliminate almost any argument for a lesser charge. Once a jury hears that a defendant tried and failed twice before finally succeeding on a third attempt, the door to any claim of accident or momentary loss of control closes almost entirely. The third thread, and arguably the most legally significant one in the long run, is the accomplice corroboration issue that eventually overturned the original conviction. It's a reminder that in criminal law, the strength of the underlying facts and the correctness of the legal process used to present those facts to a jury are 2 entirely separate questions. A case can be built on genuinely damning evidence, an insurance timeline, a cooperating witness's detailed confession, forensic detail about the shooting itself, and still be vulnerable to reversal if the trial court fails to give the jury the specific legal framework required to evaluate that evidence properly. Damon Lovell wasn't a neutral witness. He was, by his own admission, an active participant who provided the money and the weapon. New York law requires that jurors be told, explicitly, that testimony from someone in that position needs independent corroboration before it can support a conviction on its own, and the absence of that instruction became the single thread that unraveled an otherwise seemingly airtight case. There's a fourth thread worth nodding to, one that's less about the courtroom and more about pattern recognition after the fact. The insurance policy taken out on her second husband, Jose Abreu, wasn't part of the criminal case against her for Omar's murder, since it happened afterward and involved a different, uncharged relationship. But prosecutors made sure the jury heard about it anyway, because pattern evidence like that, even when it isn't the subject of formal charges, tends to reframe how a jury interprets everything else. A single insurance policy taken out on a spouse might, in isolation, look like nothing more than responsible financial planning. A second policy, taken out on a second husband, following an affair, following a first husband's suspicious and financially lucrative death, stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a documented behavioral pattern, which is precisely how prosecutors chose to frame it. Psychological analysis. At the center of this case is a pattern that criminal psychologists and investigators sometimes describe using the term Black Widow, a case where a spouse is killed and financial gain, almost always through life insurance, sits at the center of the motive, and where that same behavioral pattern shows signs of repeating with a subsequent partner. What makes the Noel Murray case such a stark illustration of that pattern isn't just that a policy was taken out a second time. It's the speed and the sequence. Most people who lose a spouse, even under ordinary circumstances, take years to feel ready to remarry. Alicia moved from a murdered husband to a new marriage in under 20 months, and brought the exact same financial instrument into that new relationship almost immediately. That kind of speed suggests the marriage itself may have functioned less as an emotional partnership and more as a financial structure, one that could be entered into and apparently exited from with a fairly consistent operating logic behind it. The second layer worth examining is the sheer persistence behind the original plan. Poison first. When that failed, a hired shooter. When that missed, a second hired shooter. There's a common assumption in true crime storytelling that murder, even planned murder, often has a single, discrete moment where a person crosses an irreversible line. This case doesn't fit that model at all. It shows someone crossing that line, failing, and simply trying again twice, over a span of roughly 4 months. That kind of repeated commitment to an outcome, despite repeated failure, tends to point less toward a single moment of desperation, and more toward a fixed, sustained goal that the person involved wasn't willing to abandon regardless of the obstacles in front of it. The third layer is the use of another person as both a tool and eventually a liability. Damon Lovell wasn't simply an affair partner kept separate from the marriage. He was brought into the house, made a participant, and ultimately handed the responsibility of physically arranging the killing, providing the weapon Alicia gave him, and the initial payment out of his own pocket. In cases like this, investigators often note a specific dynamic, where the person orchestrating the crime keeps enough physical and legal distance from the actual violence to maintain a claim of ignorance later, while still directing nearly every practical detail behind the scenes. It's a structure that offers protection right up until the moment a cooperating witness decides that protecting themselves matters more than protecting the person who once promised to protect them. Finally, there's the detail that tends to unsettle people the most whenever this case comes up. The fact that Alicia was reportedly upstairs with her 10-month-old child while the shooting happened downstairs. Whatever was happening internally for her in that moment, waiting, listening for confirmation, remaining still while a hired gunman finished what she'd spent months trying to arrange. It's a detail that sits at the very edge of what most people can imagine bringing themselves to do. And it's part of why, even years later, with an appellate court ordering a new trial over a legal technicality rather than any factual dispute, this case continues to resurface in true crime retrospectives, documentary specials, and, now, in stories exactly like this one.